Hello and welcome to the Peak Vision. Today we're going to talk about Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer was a German philosopher from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. 19th centuries, he had a rather unique worldview, but also a very dark, very pessimistic one. And today I'd like to present the main principles of his philosophy, because I am certain they'll give you something to think about. But first, who was Schopenhauer? Schopenhauer was a rather peculiar man, both in his philosophy and his personality. He was quite bitter, rather misanthropic, and didn't hesitate to attack his intellectual adversaries, heading even with insults in Schopenhauer's time. The most famous and popular philosopher was Hegel, and Schopenhauer hated Hegel. He hated him so much that he even asked for his lectures at the University of Berlin to be scheduled on the same day and at the same time as Hegel, just to compete with him. Unfortunately for Schopenhauer, Hegel's lecture hall was packed, while his own was almost empty. That's why Schopenhauer called Hegel a university philosopher. And coming from him, that wasn't a compliment. If you know what I mean, in Schopenhauer's view, the university doesn't teach real philosophy. It teaches official institutional philosophy to him. The university is the ideological arm of the state, and therefore of power. And a true philosopher can't be validated by power. If he is, then he's not a true philosopher. So Schopenhauer was a rebellious philosopher, a defiant philosopher, but maybe also a philosopher who was a bit frustrated by not being recognized in his time as a great thinker. So I was saying that Schopenhauer had a rather unique worldview. Well, let's dive into it. He presents this worldview in his most well-known work, a monumental book titled The World as Will and Representation, published in 1818. In this book, Schopenhauer explains that the world around us, the world as we see it, as we perceive it, is not the true world. Rather, it's the envelope of the world, what we might call the outer face of the world. This is what he calls the world as representation. He uses the term representation because it's the world as we represent it to ourselves. So what are the main characteristics of the world as a representation? There are three. The first characteristic of the world as a representation is that it's made of matter. The world as we perceive it is a physical world, a world made of earth, water, and air, a world of mountains, forests, and oceans. It's a tangible world, what Plato called the S-Ibal world, by the way. When we speak of the world, the image that usually comes to mind is that of our planet or the cosmos, in other words, the physical universe. So ultimately, saying that the world as representation is material and saying that it is perceptible is really saying the same thing, because perception deals with material things. So that's the first characteristic of the world as representation. It's a material world. The second characteristic is that the world as representation is governed by a law, the law of causality. In other words, everything that happens has a cause. That's the law of causality. Every event has a cause. Therefore, the world as representation is rational. And if it's rational, that means it's understandable. This is what scientists do. They try to understand how the world works, and they can do this precisely because the world is rational. If the world weren't rational, if there could be effects without causes or effects that have no connection to their causes, the world would not be understandable. So to recap, the world is representation, is material, and therefore perceptible. It's rational and therefore understandable. But that's not all the world as representation is also the world of space and time in our world. Everything necessarily exists in a given space and at a given time. This is why it's impossible to imagine something outside of space and time. For example, we cannot picture the idea of infinite distance because infinity doesn't fit in our minds. We also cannot picture eternal time, time without a beginning or an end. We can understand the concept of eternity just as we can understand the concept of infinity, but we cannot represent them to ourselves. That's the point. Everything we represent to ourselves, we represent here or there, above or below, to the left or to the right. We represent it now or before or after. Things have limits in space and time. So those are the three main characteristics of the world as a representation. It is material, it is rational, and it exists in space and time. Now let's move on to the world as will. What does Schopenhauer mean by will? The will Schopenhauer talks about isn't will in the human sense of the word. It's not intention or decision. The will he's referring to is the internal energy of the world. It's the invisible force that animates everything in the visible world. It's what we might call the elusive core of reality. Why is it elusive? Because the human mind can't represent will. As I mentioned earlier, the human mind can't imagine anything outside of space and time. Yet this will is outside of space and time in the same way. We might say that God is outside of space and time, he is beyond it. The will is in God, but like God, the will is beyond the capacities of our intellect, so we cannot represent the will. We cannot know the will in the sense that we cannot mentally picture it, but we can know the effects of the will. We can know its expression. Now, the expression of the will is the world as representation, and it is no coincidence that I'm using the word expression, which comes from the Latin expr, meaning to press out or to push out. In this sense, the world as representation is what is pushed out. It is what is expressed by the world, as, well, let me put it another way for Schopenhauer. The will is the inner reality of the world, while representation is the outer reality, the surface of the world. Let's use an image, the image of the ocean. The surface of the ocean is its representation. It's what we perceive, what is expressed by the ocean. Meanwhile, the will is the ocean's depths. The surface of the ocean is visible, accessible to our senses, and accessible to knowledge, the ocean's depths. However, are inaccessible to us. Of course, this analogy is imperfect because we can dive into the ocean, but we can't dive into the will. We are bound to remain at the surface in the world of representation. So what Schopenhauer tells us is that, in the end, we don't really know the world. We only know its surface, its outer layer, its representation. Now we need to make one thing clear for us, for most ordinary human beings. The world as representation is the only world that exists. What I mean is when you look at the world around you, you don't say to yourself, this world I perceive as the world as representation. You just say, this is the world, plain and simple. If you have a bottle of water in front of you, you have a bottle of water. If you have a tree in front of you, you have a tree, period. You don't have the representation of a bottle of water or the representation of a tree. In other words, for us, the world is what we see of the world. It's what we perceive of the world. That's the only reality, what our senses allow us to perceive, or perhaps what our measuring instruments allow us to perceive. We don't perceive radio waves with the naked eye, just like we don't see certain colors with the naked eye, like infrared or ultraviolet. And yet we know they exist. How do we know they exist? We know because we have measuring instruments that allow us to perceive what our senses alone cannot. But do these instruments allow us to go beyond the world, as representation do? They allow us to pierce the mystery of the will. No, because the will belongs to a different order of reality, an order that is beyond, or rather beneath perception, beneath representation. When scientists produce knowledge, they produce knowledge about physical reality, about material reality. They produce knowledge about the world as representation. What Schopenhauer tells us is that there is an underworld, and that this underworld is the real world, while our world is a false world, a world of illusions. So let's dive a bit deeper into this. Human beings possess consciousness so far, nothing too complicated. Consciousness makes humans animals capable of representing the world they live in. To represent doesn't just mean to perceive, it also means to think we represent the world, both through our senses and intellectually, conceptually. That's what it means to say that humans have the ability to represent the world, so humans are animals endowed with consciousness. And they take great pride in that. What I mean is humans are convinced that because of their consciousness, they are superior to other animals. And we can understand why, thanks to consciousness, we can study, understand, and therefore master the world we live in. That's no small thing. But what Schopenhauer tells us is that this faculty of representation that humans possess is ultimately not much. Humans are wrong to believe they are superior just because they have consciousness. Because even if we can understand how the world works, according to the principle of causality, we mentioned earlier, we remain fundamentally incapable of grasping its deeper meaning. We figured out some things about the world: gravity, fluid mechanics, the evolution of species, etc. But the deeper meaning of existence escapes us. The deeper meaning of reality escapes us. We know how the world works, at least in part, but we still don't know why the world exists. Why is there something rather than nothing? That's the great metaphysical question posed by Leibniz. And it's a question we cannot answer. So it's all well and good to say that we are superior animals capable of understanding how the world around us works. But the reality is we only understand the surface of our world to truly grasp the world in its essence, in its depth. We would need to penetrate the will of the world, and that we are structurally incapable of doing so. If the will is inaccessible to us, if it's impossible to know anything about it, then what can we say about it? Isn't Schopenhauer contradicting himself by talking about a world he claims we can't say anything about? Well, not exactly. Remember what I mentioned earlier. I said that the world as representation is an expression of the world as, well, let me use a different word instead of expression, manifestation. The world as representation is a manifestation of the world as will, and we as human beings, as products of the world, as beings born from the world, are manifestations of the will. So if we were able to truly know ourselves, we would also be able to know an aspect of the will, the aspect under which the will manifests itself through us. Does that make sense? So what does man know about himself? He knows he's alive. That's the most basic thing about being human. We're alive. I'm pretty sure I'm not telling you anything new now. If we ask the question, why do we live well? That's where things get more complicated. You might be tempted to say, we live because we live. What more is there to say? We live because about 4 billion years ago, amino acids formed from organic matter. Those amino acids combined to form proteins, and through interactions with their environment, those proteins gave rise to complex structures capable of reproducing. That's the origin of life, great. But why did this happen? Why these amino acids? Why these proteins? Why life? In other words, we know how life appeared, but we don't know why life appeared. And to that, how has an answer? The will. It is the will that makes life exist. Everything that exists comes from the will. And what do we know about life? We know that its fundamental characteristic is to seek to perpetuate itself. And in animals, how does life perpetuate itself? Well, it perpetuates through the instinct of reproduction. All animals have the instinct to reproduce. And that instinct is just one part of a bigger instinct. The instinct for self-preservation, or what we also call the survival instinct. Now, why is the instinct to reproduce a part of the survival instinct? Because on a collective level, at the level of the species, not reproducing means condemning oneself to extinction. If we stopped reproducing right now in about 100 years, humanity would no longer exist. So from a strictly biological point of view, the sexual act isn't just about pleasure. Its main purpose is to preserve the species, to safeguard it. And that's something we need to keep in mind. So let's go back to life. We don't know the purpose of life, but perhaps the question doesn't even make sense. The only purpose of life that we know for sure is self-perpetuation. Life seeks to perpetuate itself indefinitely, and to do that, it drives us to reproduce. Well, that's what the will is, a blind, absurd force that seeks to perpetuate itself indefinitely. And for that, it takes the form of what Schopenhauer calls the will to live. And we as living beings are the instruments of this will to live. We are instruments of the will, which needs us to perpetuate itself by reproducing. We give life to the will, so to speak, in the sense that we extend its existence by extending our own in itself. The will is personal. As I mentioned earlier, the will is a blind force, but it's a blind force that incarnates itself. It incarnates itself in living species and in the individuals that make up these species. In this sense, every living being participates in the will, since every living being is endowed with an instinct for survival, conservation, and reproduction, which allows it to perpetuate the will while also perpetuating itself. Okay, I know my argument might sound a bit strange to you because in our everyday lives, we don't really think about it that way. We don't go around thinking that when we want to have kids is to keep the will going. We just think we want kids to watch them grow, raise them, and love them. We don't see it as following the will. We see it as something we simply want to do. But Schopenhauer says that's just an illusion. We hide the fact that we're biologically programmed, meaning driven by the will to reproduce, behind all the talk about how great it is to become parents and how much we love our kids. And when I say hide, I don't mean we're doing it on purpose. We're not even aware of it. We don't realize that by having kids, we're actually just helping to keep the will going. Can you imagine if right before having sex, you thought, I'm working for the will, I'm about to contribute to the perpetuation of the will to live? That would be pretty awkward. And yet that's exactly what's happening. Each of us is an individual agent of the will. And when we decide to have children, when we decide to reproduce, we aren't aware that in fact we're just instruments of the will, which uses us as a way to perpetuate itself. So what bugs us about this idea, what really bothers us, is that it takes away our sense of free will. It turns us into nothing more than instruments of the will. What Schopenhauer tells us is that we aren't really free. We aren't free in the sense that we're determined by the will to want what we want, to decide what we decide, and to do what we do. In fact, the example of sexuality fits perfectly when we feel sexual desire for someone. It's not something we choose. It's a force from deep within us that takes hold of us. Sexual desire isn't rational or thought out. It's a drive that is the source of life, which means it's the source of our desire to have children today. We tend to separate sexual desire from reproduction. Because we've invented contraception with contraception, we can engage in sex without the risk of having children. But for millions of years, sexuality and reproduction weren't separate. They were linked. Having sex inherently carried the risk of having children. So there was a good reason to think twice, a good reason to control our impulses rather than letting our impulses control us. So we aren't free as individuals. We aren't free because we unknowingly obey the all-powerful will. And if we think we're free, it's precisely because we aren't aware that we're working for the will. If we were aware, maybe we'd stop working for it. Maybe we'd stop reproducing. Stop participating in the fundamental absurdity of existence as an act of defiance. But the truth is, we don't know. Some of you might know the movie. The usual suspects in the movie, 5 criminals are being questioned by the police about a massacre that happened on a boat. At one point, the name of the person responsible for the massacre comes up, Kaiser Sa. Kaiser Sa is the figure of a criminal who terrifies everyone, including other criminals, because he's as intelligent as he is ruthless. The peculiarity of Kaiser Sa is that the people who work for him don't know they're working for him. They can meet him, talk to him, even interrogate him, and never realize he's Kaiser Sa, or they figure it out when it's already too late. Well, the will is like Kaiser Sa. It makes individuals work in the world of representation without telling them, without even letting them realize it. And yet they do. They do it willingly. What's more effective than getting people to work? Not because you ask them to, but because they want to. When we reproduce, when we have kids, we do it willingly. We don't feel like we're doing it for someone else or for some other reason. That's the trick. The will doesn't tell us it's there, but it's still running the show. Think about it. Life has no real purpose, but we keep reproducing it. Life has no meaning, but we still want to live. Isn't that pretty much the definition of absurdity? And this brings us to a very interesting aspect of Schopenhauer's philosophy, the question of love. So what is love? Well, it probably won't surprise you to hear that for Schopenhauer, love is just another illusion. It's a trick the will plays on us to make sure we keep the species going, to make sure we agree to the never-ending cycle of life. What happens when we're in love? When we're in love, we want to unite with the person we love in every sense of the word. And from that love, a child will be born. Love, then, is the means by which the will ensures its own perpetuation. Now you might say, but love isn't what makes us reproduce. It's sexual desire that makes us reproduce, yes. But for Schopenhauer, love and sexual desire are essentially the same thing. Or rather, love is the culturally acceptable form of sexual desire. I mentioned earlier that man is an animal, but he's an animal that refuses to accept his own animality. Even though we know, biologically speaking, that we are animals, there's something in us that refuses is to accept this. It's like we want to be more than animals. The idea that we could behave exactly like animals, copulating instinctively and leaving behind offspring, is something our conscience can't bear. But for Schopenhauer, that's just vanity pride. Another illusion, ultimately, what is human intelligence? If not the ability to place a veil of illusions over reality. So we do not accept the fact that we are animals, and to mask this reality, to conceal it from our consciousness, we create illusions. Cultural artifices. Love is a cultural artifice, and romantic seduction is the strategy humans use to forget that when they're attracted to someone of the opposite sex, what they really desire deep down is to reproduce with them. Seduction is a roundabout path to reproduction, which ultimately means the perpetuation of the species. So just keep in mind, ladies, that when a guy's flirting with you, what he's really doing is trying to keep the species going through you. And if you go along with it, you're agreeing to do the same through him. Basically, the whole process of seduction is like a maze. It's all about getting to the sexual act, but it also tries to make you forget that that's the real goal. And that's why Schopenhauer has a problem with human beings, because he has a problem with hypocrisy. Hypocrisy because when we seduce, we do everything to hide our real intentions. We do everything to cover up the destination. We hope the seduction will lead to the bedroom. That's the real end goal. The rest, smiles, compliments, attention, are just decoration. They're the garlands we place on our instincts to forget that we're driven by them, to forget that at the core, we're still animals, by the way. Schopenhauer has an amusing phrase. He says it is after copulation that the devil's laughter is heard. What he means is that it's after the sexual act is finished that one becomes aware of its absurdity. He seems to be referring more to men here, though the feeling could apply to anyone after sex. The feeling of shame that overwhelms humans is actually a moment of lucidity, a realization of our animality. And this animality, this raw and primitive force that shows itself through sexual instinct in a totally irrational and uncontrolled way, is the will. So love is nature's trick. The will's trick to make us consent to the endless repetition of the cycle of life. But at the root of love, at the root of all desire for union lies sexual instinct. Sexual instinct is the alpha and omega of life. And I quote, "Sexual passion is the cause of war and the end of peace, the basis of what is serious and the aim of the G, the inexhaustible source of wit, the key to all illusions and the meaning of all mysterious hints, of all unspoken offers and all stolen glances, the daily meditation of the young and often also of the old, the hourly thought of the unchaste and even against their will, the constantly recurring imagination of the chaste, the ever-ready material of a joke, just because the profoundest seriousness lies at its foundation. It is, however, the peak and element in the joke of life that the chief concern of all men is secretly pursued and ostensibly ignored as much as possible. Indeed, one may say, man is concrete, sexual desire for his origin is an act of copulation, and his wish of wishes is an act of copulation. And this tendency alone perpetuates and holds together his whole phenomenal existence. The will to live manifests itself indeed primarily as an effort to sustain the individual, yet this is only a step to the effort to sustain aim. The species in the latter endeavor must be more powerful in proportion as the life of the species surpasses that of the individual in duration, extension, and value. Therefore, sexual passion is the most perfect manifestation of the will to live. For Schopenhauer, existence is a tragedy. It's a tragedy because life is absurd, and yet we do everything we can to perpetuate this absurdity. Life isn't just absurd, it's also a source of suffering. Life, Schopenhauer tells us, oscillates like a pendulum from suffering to boredom. And because existence is a tragedy, it's something that must eventually come to an end for Schopenhauer. It's very clear we must stop reproducing. We must stop participating in this endless perpetuation of the will, which is nothing but a cycle of suffering and unhappiness. Life might offer a few rare moments of happiness, like the joy of aesthetic contemplation, but beyond that, there's nothing to hope for in life, nothing to hope for in an absurd world. Nothing to hope for from a world of suffering. On that note, enjoy life.